Welcome everybody here. And I will warn you that today I've been thinking, um, I hate to say it, I'm thinking somewhat deeply today about some things. And so I'm going to get into that stuff later that may or may not be of interest, but it's probably going to be a little more introspective than you are accustomed to me being in these chats. So let me get right into it. As you know, I hate to just sit around for a while. And let me hit some of the questions some of the questions that you started by asking today. First of all, why is the radical right going after Taylor Swift? And the answer to that is, I think, somewhat obvious. It is that going after Taylor Swift gets them attention. End of discussion. Think about how many people are now talking about them and their reaction to Taylor Swift. It's what's called earned media, which is a term that you use in when you're in the media. And it means that you don't have to pay for advertising. It means that you have created enough of a story that people call you and they want to report on it. So one of the reasons that the radical right says these outrageous things and goes after, creates these crazy things like CRT and DEI and all these attacks they go on is because it gets the media. And certainly what they're doing is they're hitching themselves to Taylor Swift's star and saying outrageous things about her and complaining about her because it gets them headlines. And so for today's Republican Party, there's a couple of things going on. There is partly the attempt to get eyeballs on what you're saying so that you theoretically could get elected. But in some case like this, it is probably more likely that this is part of what I would consider the right-wing grifter machine that simply wants a lot of clicks because you get money if you get clicks. And that's something that I don't study. And I actually keep threatening to chase down some of my friends who do deep dives into investigative journalism, because I would love to know how much money there is behind some of the grifts that we see around us. Because, you look at some of the real headline people out there, and I guess it's, well, I guess I won't say any names, but there are certainly people who say outrageous things and then sell supplements, or say outrageous things and then translate that into huge amounts of money. And so I think partly they're going after Taylor Swift for the clickability of it, and also because she is, of course, much more outspoken now about her dislike for Donald Trump and about her support for Biden, and that, of course, is attractive to younger people who follow her, and I don't think just younger people who follow her. By the way, I actually happen to think that she's a really interesting cultural phenomenon as well as a musical phenomenon, in that she has created over the course of the last summer a multicultural, multiracial, and multi-generational movement. And those movements don't necessarily have to be explicitly articulated to be behind a certain kind of politics, so much as to remind people of the values that the people who are attending them grapple. So, when you're out at a concert with your mom and your sister and your best friend, you're thinking about community, you're thinking about friendships, you're thinking about kinship ties, you're thinking about the sorts of values that currently support the Democratic Party. And if you're going to a Unite the Right rally, you're thinking about hatred and those sorts of emotions that unite that particular group of people. And so to have the kind of tour that she had, enforcing those sorts of values, even if she was singing about haters, for example, or the many things she sings about, I think is an existential threat to those people who oppose those values. That's just kind of my thought about what that kind of organizing does, and about why, for example, people turn out to music concerts and what's behind those. There's a longer story there that's sort of interesting, but that's probably not why you're here, so I won't go into that. All right. Oh, you're by the pool in Puerto Vallarta. Oh man. Anyway, so that was the first question you asked, and I think a fairly easy one. Another one you asked was what is going on with the request that we learned about yesterday, in which the Department of Justice asked the House of Representatives for documents. And the answer to that straight up is we don't know. But, isn't there always a but? We don't know, but there are rumors from or scoops from a well-established journalist who does get good scoops that the Department of Justice, and by that I mean a grand jury, this was a grand jury subpoena, is looking into security arrangements made by Representative Cori Bush of Missouri, a Democrat. That could be wrong. They could be looking to do a bunch of things. We don't really know. The fact that there's been so little outcry about it among the radical right suggests that it is probably something fairly routine, as in not the kind of bombshell things you saw on social media. So we don't know what that is, but those people who think that it is somehow related to the Congress critters who were trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election, I'm guessing probably not. But certainly I could be wrong because we don't know yet. One of the things that I do is I actually try and find the documents and the things on which people are basing their statements. And we just don't have the documents yet in that. What we have is the notification from the Department House of Representatives that it had received this request and it was going to respond to the request. And that happened yesterday. So we don't know. We don't know what that looks like. But for those people who think that we're at this great end of the Congress critters, I would expect that there's a lot going on with that, but not that seems to have anything to do with that request from the Department of Justice to the House of Representatives. Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't, by the way, people give me credit for naming the people in Congress critters. That was actually Molly Ivins. I'm almost certain. I don't think I'm creative enough to have done that. And doesn't it sound like Molly Ivins? And I read a lot of Molly Ivins in the past. So don't give me credit for that one. I love it, but I don't think it's mine. All right. So another question you asked about, that's easy to get away from, to get rid of here. Oh, so one of the big stories that is only now getting picked up by the mainstream media is the release of an Inspector General's report about the distribution of medicine from the White House during the Trump administration. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons. Now, remember, I am not a doctor and have virtually zero experience with any drugs at all, illicit or licit. So I'm just looking at what I read. And the Inspector General's report says that operating out of the Trump White House was a distribution of drugs that were unregulated and seemingly extraordinary. The distribution of fentanyl, for example, and a number of heavy-duty drugs, opiates and things like that are people say is really bad news, and that the Inspector General's report itself says is highly unusual because they were looking at a whole bunch of different distribution places and said this is really an outlier. And the trick to that is this was an Inspector General's report, so that's from within the organization itself, and they said they located that there was a real issue right here in that. So one of the things you're seeing on social media is people saying, "Oh, every White House is like that," and the answer is simply no, it's not. And the issue though is that that's all we know right now. We do not have a deeper dive into where those drugs were going or who was distributing them. There were a lot of irregularities in that particular office, and it is seemingly a huge scandal. But right now, not enough threads have been pulled that I have seen anyway to know who is behind that. I mean, I think we probably all have some guesses, but who is behind that and what was happening to those drugs? And we just don't know yet. It would be a little hard for me to imagine that nothing is going to come of that Inspector General's report because it was pretty eye-popping. You should take a look at it if you haven't. I haven't written about it yet because I wanted to fit it in the right place. You know, one of the things that is an issue for me right now when I write at night is that there's so many stories that I don't want to just be somebody who says this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, because then you can't make sense of it. So I'm trying to group them in ways that make sense. And if I had written, as I did last night, about the pending immigration deal, the pending deal for hostages versus a pause in fighting, not a ceasefire, a pause in fighting in Israel slash Gaza. And if I just suddenly thrown the drugs in there, you'd all been like, what's this doing here? So that will appear in the letters. I don't know when. Probably not tonight because I'm working on something else. So that's another story to be watching. All right. I'm trying to look at my list here. You have asked, and I'll probably come back to this, but you have asked about whether Nikki Haley actually has a shot at getting the Republican nomination for president in 2024. And the answer to that is something that's a little unusual. And that is, we do not know how this year is going to go in terms of the Republican nomination. And what I mean by that is we have never before dealt with a presidential candidate who is under these criminal indictments and has been found liable for sexual assault slash rape and fraud, and is hemorrhaging money. He's had so far about 83 and then 5 is 88, about $88 million judgments against him. And of course, Judge Engeron from Manhattan, who is doing the other case about how Trump, in which Trump has already been found guilty. Trump and the Trump Organization have already been found liable for fraud, and Trump's 2 sons and 2 members of the Trump administration. He's supposed to hand down what he considers a suitable, not just a punishment for having done that, but also what's called the disgorgement of illegitimately gotten properties. And he said he would be done by the end of the month, which is tomorrow. And the Manhattan has asked for, I think it's $270 million in that case, and for Trump not being able to do business in Manhattan any longer, or I'm sorry, in New York any longer. And of course, that's just going to rip the bottom out from under his financing as well as his finance is. So, so in terms of this nomination process, nobody knows how it's going to go. And it is very clear that Trump is also kind of losing it mentally, and that we could unpack more if you're interested. But also, he is not in very good health. So one of and certainly he's mentally not in a very good state. And he's also saying a lot of things that are deeply troubling. Anyway, all that to say, and I'll talk more about this in just a second, the Trump organization, not the financial one, but the Trump political organization has managed to engraft itself into state Republican parties in such a way that it's going to be almost impossible for anybody else to get the Republican nomination as we are currently going. But I think what Haley is doing is recognizing that there are 10 months between now and the election. And in those 10 months, you have a front-running candidate who is already in hot water, both financially and legally, for cases that have already been decided or are being decided in the next few days. But then we also have these larger cases out there as well. And the more he gets shown in public, the more people are going to recognize that mentally he's not okay, which is one of the reasons that Haley keeps hammering on the idea of him doing a debate with her. She keeps saying, "What are you afraid of? You got to come out, you got to debate me." And you think about the two of them, Haley gets, I think, unfairly considered a lightweight. And he's certainly trying to feed that by calling her bird brain and all that. But, she is the last person standing. And you don't get, one of the things I always talk about, I certainly tell my students, is that you don't get to be in a place like that by accident. You don't get to be, one of the things you used to hear sometimes was that First Lady Melania Trump was stupid or whatever. I'm like, no, I'm sorry. You do not get to be the First Lady of the United States because you played your cards badly. That's somebody who plays their cards very well. Now, it may be that we don't look and see how those cards are being played, so it doesn't look like that to those of us on the outside. But I promise you don't get as a person of that background, you don't get to that position without knowing how to play certain cards. And in this case, I think it's a mistake to dismiss Haley and to say she doesn't know what she's doing, because where's Ron DeSantis, right? So I think what she is doing is trying to weaken Trump, trying to needle him, trying to make him angrier and angrier because that shows his mental instability. And by doing that, if in fact something happens to him, if in fact he's convicted or he drops out or his health takes a turn or whatever, she will be the only logical place to go. So I'm really tired of hearing these stories about people saying, "Oh, she should drop out because he's won it." The reason that the Republican National Committee chair Ronna McDaniel, for example, is trying to make that argument, and the reason people are trying, and Trump himself are trying to get her to go away, is because they recognize that she is badly weakening him, and weakening him in a way that will add fuel to the idea that he needs to drop out at some point. And so she doesn't need to win. She needs to stay vertical is what she needs to do. And as I say, I suspect she knows that and that's what she's doing. That's certainly what I would be doing in her position. So that is what I think is up with Haley, which you asked about. Now, a couple other things that, let me get into this and then I can to cut into some of the other things that you have asked about. So let me do the 14th Amendment again. The 14th Amendment and whether or not Trump is disqualified under the third section of the 13th Amendment, there are people flooding the Supreme Court right now with amicus briefs, that is friends of the court briefs, that don't have a stake and aren't representing somebody, but they have opinions about what should happen in that particular case. And one of the ones you've asked about is the amicus brief that came from a number of historians yesterday. I think it was 25 of them, and they're terrific scholars. They have really run down the history of exactly whether or not people at the time of Reconstruction, when the 14th Amendment was written in 66, it was put into the Constitution in 68, 1866 and 1868, what they were up to. And it's interesting reading. And if you do decide to read them, they're very easy to find. Just Google amicus briefs, 14th Amendment, and a whole bunch will come up because there's a whole lot of them. And you can just go to that particular one. I think the first writer goes by, his name is Orville Vernon Burton. He goes by Vernon Burton. He's a very dear friend of mine. And I think that's how you can find the historians. And what they've literally done is they've gone through the congressional record and they've looked at every time that somebody in the debates over the 14th and in the lead up to the 14th talked about what it meant to be an officer of the courts and all that. And that's actually really interesting. But at the end of the day, what they're saying is pretty obvious to anybody who studies that period. And that is that, of course, when the people who wrote the 14th Amendment, who are Republicans, by the way, for the most part, when they wrote that, of course, they intended to keep people like Donald Trump from being able to hold office under the United States. And of course, they considered the presidency an office, which is another argument that some people on the radical right are making. They're saying, well, a president isn't an office under the Constitution. And that's, I mean, I listen to me, I'm stammering because that's just stupid. I mean, I'm sorry, it's just stupid. So that the idea that at the time they wanted to exclude people like Trump, that's, you don't hear me swear much, but when I was a kid growing up, we would have called that one something like "No shit, Sherlock. What's your next clue?" Right? But the next step to that is, how does that happen? So one of the reasons it's very important that Judge Michael Luttig, a conservative judge, has gotten on board and has gotten so much attention for this, is he said it is self-executing. That is, you don't have to be convicted of having engaged in insurrection. You don't have to have a law passed. You don't have to do anything. It just is what it is. So in the same way that I could, never mind, that my kid can't go and say I'm running for president because they're too young. And the person would just say, you can't, you're too young. In this case, they're saying that is self-executing. And a lot of the fighting is over whether or not that is self-executing. And if not, who decides? How do you make that happen? And these are one of the questions that are going through. So to my mind, as a historian, and I am also a historian of that period, this is just an absolute no-brainer. And we can look at instances where indeed, when it came time for people to run for office, Republicans at the time said, no, you can't. and that it was just upheld that you couldn't because it was demonstrated that you had participated in the Confederacy. So that's what's going on with that, and it's going to be interesting because the Supreme Court does not want to have to deal with this, and it's going to have to. And I don't want to get in that now because I actually am thinking about something else that I'm very interested in, and I want to just be clear that I'm thinking about this, but it's maybe a different way to think about all the things that are happening in the country right now that you may find useful and you may not find useful, and you may think I'm wrong, and that's fine. If you do, by all means, tell me. Be nice if you don't mind, but these are ideas that I'm playing with for a different reason, and I'm actually trying them out here first. So there you go. So one of the other things that that you all asked about is what's happening with Greg Abbott on the border. And Greg Abbott is the governor of Florida. I'm sorry, governor of Texas. Interesting. I always thought of him and DeSantis in the same breath, sort of, although they're very different in some ways. And this idea that you are reading in the papers that he is defying the federal government. And I'm not sure that's what's happening, because what Greg Abbott has done is, after the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 decision, and I think it was last week, I lose track of time, said that the federal government could cut the razor wire that the state of Texas had put in place to get access to the park that processes immigrants. Which, I'm sorry, not immigrants, they're migrants because they're applying for refugees, for asylum, where the people died in the river a week or so ago. He hasn't done anything. And that, I think, is really important in a number of ways, because what he did was he made a statement in which he said that the state of Texas has the constitutional right to defend itself from an invasion. It has the constitutional right to do that. And what he is saying is he is trying to take away from the federal government control over borders and control over immigration, which has been well established as being part of the purview of the federal government really since the founding of the Constitution. One of the reasons we get the Constitution is because a number of states are starting to make their own deals with foreign countries. And pretty quickly, the smaller states recognize that if New York can make its own treaties with other countries because they've got the Port of New York, that everybody else is going to end up being a tributary to New York. And if they actually want to be independent states, they got to have somebody working together for all of them and not everybody for themselves. So that's pretty well established. So what's going on? What is Abbott doing? And I think that there is a larger question here about, if somebody just asked that, let me write that down. Hold on. I think that what we are looking at is a much larger question in American history. And that issue is the ongoing conflict between the states and the federal government. And one of the things that people during Reconstruction study, but honestly, it's a constant in our history, is that when you have a minority that wants to govern, and that minority is almost always white men of wealth. And I say almost always because there might be an exception. I can't think of one, but there might be. It's an old trick in writing. You never say, I know the one thing, because human nature automatically says, wait, I know another thing, right? So when you get a minority that wants to rule over a majority, they always focus on the states and on state government. Why do they focus on the states and on state government? Because it's way easier to control a state than it is to control a federal government. Because if you're in a state, a small state, and I'm going to pick on Kentucky. in 1790. 1798, as one does, right? Um, if you're trying to get power over the government and you're in Kentucky in 1798, it is way easier to make friends with the judges and to, to maybe buy a few drinks for the voters and to do the, to get in good with people and to get your people in the legislature. And they're pretty soon going to start to write laws that you like, rather than trying to get control over the federal government. Because people in Maine might look at the guy, or Massachusetts at the time, I'm sorry, people in Massachusetts might look at the people from Kentucky and be like, you guys are weenies. We don't want to do what you want. We want to do it our way. So historically in America, it has always been easier to take control of the states and by a small minority. And the reason I say that is also the fact that states get to decide, because of our weird system, states get to decide who can vote in them. So if you start to take power, and then, as happened in New Jersey in the same period, a bunch of women said, well, no, we don't like you. What do? You say, oh, women can't vote in New Jersey any longer, which is exactly what happened in the early republic. Women had been able to vote in New Jersey. They started to vote against the party that was in power in New Jersey, and the party in power tossed them all out. Women didn't get to vote in New Jersey again for more than 100 years. So by keeping your power in the state, by getting to determine who can vote in that state, a minority can say, hey, we're going to arrange the state the way we want it to be. So we are going to not let you have abortions, or not allow LGBTQ people to have driver's licenses, or we're going to make sure we have human enslavement. If you have that in the state, it's much easier than trying to do it at the national level. All right, so I hope you're with me so far on this. And the reason that I am focusing on this is, again, to go back to what Greg Abbott is doing, because I think what's happening in Texas is not really about Texas, weirdly, in the sense that Greg Abbott has had this Operation Lone Star going on now for years. I don't know if you paid attention to it. Hasn't really done much. It's cost a huge amount of money. I think it's over $10 billion. But they're really just out there kind of cosplaying, I'm sorry, not the military people. I'm a fan of the military. They're just there. They're pulling down paychecks. Many of them are very angry that they've been pulled away from their actual lives in order to run around, doing whatever it is Abbott says they should be doing. But why is he doing that? And I think what we are looking at is the use of this idea that the states are in real trouble from migrants, to try to insist that the federal government is not doing its job and the states need to be the locus of power in our system again. Now, why am I saying that? So I could run you through the history of how we have increasingly, since the 1980s, devolved power to the states after the federal government took control, for example, over civil rights for African Americans and women and, and other marginalized peoples. We got the backlash that gave us the rise of the Republican Party in the 1980s to take over and cut back on those things. But remember, the other thing that the federal government began to do in the 1930s and continued to do and continued to expand its authority over until the 1970s was overregulation of business. And that's really popular. But it is not popular among a very few wealthy people who do not want regulation of business. Okay, so I hope you're with me so far. As I say, I'm kind of thinking this through as I go. But if you look at what Abbott is doing in Florida, so far, what he has done is on paper. That is, he's got the Lone Star people out there. He shut off the Shelby Park in Eagle Pass, but he hasn't done anything new since the Supreme Court said to him, the federal government can cut your razor wire. And he hasn't stopped the federal government from cutting the razor wire when they wanted to. What I am seeing, and again, there may be more out there, but what I am seeing is an advancing of this argument that the states have more power than the federal government has ever accorded them for something as extraordinary as border security, which Texas doesn't want to have to deal with border security. It's expensive. It's very hard. They don't want to do it. And they're the only state right now that's got real issues, even though there's a bunch of border states all over this country, right? So I wonder if what he's really doing is taking a look back at the fact that that vote in the Supreme Court was 5-4. It was not unanimous. It was not the entire Supreme Court saying, you're a weenie. We've done it this way forever. This is the way it's going to be. It was 4 justices saying, hey, we're willing to think about whether or not the states should have more power. It's really kind of astonishing. That was a 5-4 decision. So what else might be going on there? And one of the other things that's before the Supreme Court right now is an attack on what's known as the Chevron decision, or it's not the Chevron doctrine. And that is a much larger assault on the regulatory state. So what that means is that the federal government has regulated business really all along, but it really started to regulate it in a big way in 1933 with the advent of the New Deal. And when it did that, what happened is Congress would say, "Hey, we need an agency that looks after the stock market, for example, or communications, or the EPA is going to be much later, but let me throw the EPA in that. We need these agencies that take care of these things on a broader level. And we just know we need, I'm going to pick on the EPA again, which is established under Nixon, under a Republican president. We need this agency that's going to make sure that people don't pour their poison into lakes and rivers and into the ground and all that. But, we're Congress critters. We don't have the time or the energy to determine what that looks like. So we're going to set up an EPA, an Environmental Protection Agency, and we're going to give them a budget. And we're going to tell them, you do it. You make the regulations for how this is going to work. And the idea behind what's known as, I say, the Chevron doctrine is that so long as they are making good faith interpretations of what Congress set up, it's hard to challenge those regulations. Now, what this new case in front of the Supreme Court, which is an artificial case, they're not supposed to take artificial cases, but it is one. There isn't really a rub any longer. The initial case was resolved, but they're still going to take it on anyway. This is an attack on that Chevron doctrine to say, wait a minute, the legislative branch, Congress, cannot give that kind of authority to the executive branch, which is where the government agencies live. That in fact, you can't go ahead and have agencies make their own decisions. Those things have to be determined by Congress. And most of the observers of this say, oh boy, this is really going to destroy the federal administrative state, because all of a sudden you've got to have Congress doing all this. If that happens, regulation just devolves back to the states, which is what, in fact, the originalist doctrines that are behind these attacks are trying to do, is trying to throw regulation back to the states, the same way the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision of June 2022, which overturned Roe versus Wade. If you remember that decision, it says, hey, this decision really belongs to the states. But what that meant was once you got into the states, very quickly, everybody discovered that the states, even red states, were really, really in favor of having abortion rights. And so what happened then? Well, the state legislatures, which had taken control of those states through gerrymandering and voter suppression, said, hey, we don't actually care what you want. We're going to go ahead and restrict the right to abortion anyway. So as I'm looking at what Abbott is doing, I am not seeing him declaring war like, let's all march and fight with guns. It honestly looks to me like he's trying to set up a stronger case to put in front of the Supreme Court to give more power to the states. So where does that lead us? Everyone's talking about the Civil War and, the president should should nationalize the Guard and send in the Air Force and the 101st Airborne and all that. I'm not sure. And I'm not sure for this reason. I think in part that would absolutely add more power to Abbott's Abbott's position. I'm not saying it's not either. I'm thinking this one through. But also, I'm not entirely sure what the airborne would do right now, because I don't think yet anyway that Abbott's done anything other than saying something on paper. Now, wait a minute, though, before you're like, oh, she doesn't care at all about the fact there might be a civil war. There's something else also that this is a part. I mean, it all worries me. But this idea that the federal government is not protecting the states, and that, that there's this invasion. There's not an invasion. And if you want to walk you through that, there's certainly a problem with the systems we have in place to handle migrants at the border. And here's a newsflash. Biden's been talking about that since literally the first week he was in office. He presented legislation the first week he was in office to have more people to process immigrants, more border security, and more protection against the influx of illicit drugs across that border, even though most of them come through ports of entry and come in handled by US citizens, just FYI. Anyway, there's certainly that problem. But what is happening, I think, is this attempt to get a lot of low information voters to rally around this idea that they have to back power in the states, and to create a crisis that makes it look like they have to back power in the states. And if you think about who will win at the end of the day, if power devolves away from the federal government into the states, it's the same people who always win whenever that happens. It's wealthy people, wealthy white men. And if you look at Abbott's background and the people he works for, or seems to be working alongside, I'm afraid it looks like that's the case, doesn't it? So when people are talking about, this crisis, I think it's a crisis, but I think it's maybe a different crisis than people are identifying when they're like, oh, we got to go in with the 101st Airborne. But here's the other piece of it. And this is the one that kind of makes my hair catch on fire. And that is that those people who follow Abbott and all the DeSantis and all the people who are trying to whip this up into an issue, they don't know it's not a real issue. They are hearing the rhetoric that these people are spouting, and they're buying it. And they have guns, and they are angry for a number of reasons. And that worries me a lot. Because if you go back now to the Civil War, which I said that, I'm not entirely sure this is a Civil War thing. If you go back to that, that's really pretty much what caused the Civil War. Is a few elite leaders got determined that they wanted to impose their minority will on the nation. The nation said, sorry, it ain't happening. We elected somebody else. They kept saying, you people are going to destroy us. You're going to attack us. We've got this huge danger of Black Americans around us, and they're all going to kill us, and it's all your fault. They had all very similar rhetoric. So that when, in fact, push came to shove, the leaders of that group kept saying, oh, it's not going to be a big deal. There's not going to be a war. One of them actually said, I'm going to drink all the blood that it's going to be shed during the Civil War. When actually the government went to resupply Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in April of 1861, those leaders knew that if they didn't do something, that their followers would turn against them. And I don't mean they would, shoot them down the streets, but they would lose political power because their leaders their followers would be like, you guys suck. You told us that we were going to fight this war and everybody was going to be full of glory and we were going to save our states and we were all going to be safe and all that. And instead, now you're saying, oh, never mind. No, that's not going to happen. So in fact, the firing on Fort Sumter by the Confederacy is in part because they need to stay out in front of that movement. They really can't get pushed into that movement. And so you look at what's happening with this whole border thing, and you see the fact that Mike Johnson, who's the Speaker of the House, said way back in November, well, I want to give money to Ukraine, but I can't give money to Ukraine unless you put in a border deal. The border deal is so important. And we got to have this, we got to give that. And fully expecting, I think, that nothing was going to happen. because had been elusive for so long. And here you had the Democrats and Biden saying, "Listen, we want to fund Ukraine so badly, we'll give you anything you want," basically. And I paraphrase. I'm sure they didn't give them everything they wanted, but it's by far the most in favor of the Republican position of any deal that they've had go through in the past. And now they got caught. Once again, the dog has caught the car, and they're like, "Oh, we didn't mean that." No, now, in fact, it's such a disaster, it's such a bad thing that only the president can deal with it. And then Trump will put in place something that will truly be horrific. And I'm not entirely sure that there will come a point when they can back down. Like, where's the off ramp here? And that's the thing that I'm wondering about, is where is the off ramp for those people who have insisted that the immigration crisis is so huge that the U.S. can't do anything else until it gets taken care of. And now they're saying, "Oh, but wait for a year because we can't do it until then." What do they do with their supporters? Like literally, what do you do with their supporters? So another piece of this is that, somebody just said Texas should secede. Once again, they talk about that, although Texas does not want to secede. I mean, you can talk about that all you want. Think of, you're going to manage your own borders. The U.S. is having trouble managing that border. Do you think that's going to change? They don't want to deal with that. What are they going to do with transit across Texas? What are they going to do with foreign affairs? What are they going to do with all the pieces of a nation that the U.S. government currently handles? The leaders do not want to secede. They talk about that a lot, but there's absolutely no way they actually want to secede. Texas can't make it on its own. For all that they're talking about, they can make it on its own. No, they can't. In fact, what you're really seeing is agitation, largely from Russian bots, for example, trying to feed that Texas is going to secede. Texas can't secede. I mean, it could, but boy, are they going to find that would be a mistake in a hurry. That's again just posturing that makes it sound really good until you actually try and do it. I always think of, when I hear things like that, I always think of toddlers. You know how 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds are, will pitch a conniption fit in front of their parents because they know their parents are not, going to take them out and feed them to the wolves, but they behave in front of strangers because strangers might take them out and feed them to the wolves. And that's one of the things I feel like we see with this radical right a lot of the time, is they keep pitching fits because they know that at the end of the day, the Democrats are not going to allow whatever it is they want to happen. But one of the kickers is they have weakened so many guardrails. I don't think they recognize that some of these things really could happen. So the other piece of that is, will the voters turn out for this crap? And the answer, I think, to that is no. And the reason I think that, and I hope this is somewhat useful, the reason I think that is because of the number of people who have in fact been held to account under the Biden administration. So the people who participated in January 6th, I think we're up to, I know we're well over 1,000 people who have been charged. I think we're up to 1,000 people who have been convicted or pled guilty, and they're paying for it. They're spending months, if not years, in jail. Trump promised to protect them and he didn't. Now you have Peter Navarro has just been sentenced to 4 months in jail, one of Trump's ringleaders. Trump can't protect him. Trump and Ronna McDaniel told a lot of people they would get lawyers for them if they participated in the false elector scheme. They didn't get lawyers. I think there is a sense that, this was great until push came to shove. But once it did, you were hung out to dry. So I suspect a lot of people who thought they were real heroes in 2020 are rethinking their position on that. And, a couple other examples of that, I don't know if you followed the story, the saga of, is it Ammon Bundy? I never know how to pronounce that. I just call him Ammon, and that's not right. Maybe it's Ammon Bundy. In one of the militia leaders who had a real standoff with the federal government, and he was always in front of one crisis or another, standing off the federal government, and he got away with it for a long time. And then during COVID, he and his supporters took on a hospital it was a really sad way for everybody. But this hospital sued. The hospital had very deep pockets, and it sued, and he lost. He lost in a really big way, like a settlement for a huge sum of money. I don't remember how much it was. and tried to get out from it underneath it, couldn't get out from under it. And he's run, he's on the lam. And you think about how powerful that man was, but once he was held accountable, he skipped town. And I wonder if you're hearing again, for example, about this convoy that was supposed to go from Florida down to Eagle Pass. And they talked again about having all these truckers, and they were going to shut down the whole border and shut down the whole country and the whole thing. And when they left Florida, they had 19 trucks, and none of them were semis. They were pickups. And, I wonder if you can always find 19 people to join into something, but I wonder if people are saying, I'm not going to participate in this because I don't want to face the courts, which is, of course, why a number of people who were involved in bad behavior want Trump back in office, because they know the courts won't pursue them under him. So anyway, that was a very long way of getting around what's actually happening on the border with Abbott. I think that the people who are doing that, who are insisting that migrants are this terrible crisis, are trying to cement their power within their states. Let me say a little bit more about that in a second. And I also think they're playing with fire. I think they certainly are creating something that they cannot control. And we know that from the past of the Republican Party. But I will say the other piece of this that worries me terribly, and that's that by taking over the states, which I think is what they're doing, there is the expectation, like the Confederates had before they left, that they can take over the nation. And what that looks to me, the reason I say that, and the reason that what it looks like to me, is that if you think about the way that former President Trump is handling this election, if you're trying to win a national election, you try and broaden support, you try and reach out to people. Trump's not doing that. Trump is actually getting rid of people, saying, I don't want Haley voters. I want just the purest people. And that says to me, logically, that he's not trying to win the election in any normal way. He doesn't care if he wins the right numbers or not. And remember, he lost the popular vote in 2016. He lost it by even more in 2020. He has not broadened that support since. So I think it's pretty logical to assume he's going to lose the popular vote in 2024 and expects to. He's already talking about how the election's going to be rigged because he knows he's not going to win the popular vote. So how can he end up in office, which he desperately needs to do if he's going to get out from under all this legal stuff? And mind you, I still maintain, and I think Jack Smith has turned out to have a lot more stuff than I expected him to, but I still maintain that the case that's going to hang him out to dry is the classified documents. I mean, he had them. He wasn't supposed to. He said he didn't have them. He signed things saying he didn't have them, or he had his lawyers sign them. And then, and it turned out he did. And that's a huge problem. I mean, again, think of how compromised. There's a bunch of things that have happened since all those papers went missing that in our foreign affairs that seem deeply troubling to me. I'm not going to mention specifics because, of course, I don't know what was in those, but watch. You'll see things that look funny. Anyway. So he needs to get out from under that, because that's not something where you get a slap on the wrist. You steal our national secrets, and you just see some guy who leaked Trump's and other people's tax returns has just gotten a 5-year jail sentence, and that was for tax returns. You take stuff that was so classified you couldn't even know it all. Different people had different pieces of it, and you take them. That's more than giving you a $250 fine. So if he's not trying to win the election, how's he going to end up in office? And that goes back to the states. And if the states end up throwing their electoral votes to Trump for whatever reason, voter suppression, gerrymandering, maybe he wins, but I think what they're really trying to do is game the states. And if the states put forward enough electoral votes to elect him, that would be ducky for him. But I think there's real concerns about whether or not that will happen, even in states like Texas. I think that's one of the reasons Texas is pushing immigration as hard as it is because Texas women are pissed off about that draconian Texas law that has put their lives into real jeopardy. And they're angry at Texas Governor Greg Abbott's attempt to force through the voucher system in Texas, because it would have destroyed public schools in Texas. And they recognize that that's, Texas public schools are a way of life, right? With football and with all that. So I think even in Texas, they recognize that they're walking uphill, and that they need to be certain that they find some way to make sure they get the Texas vote. And they're trying to do that by insisting that there is this invasion and everybody has to get behind the invasion, behind the state to get rid of this invasion. But the other piece that really worries me is that that if there is enough confusion around this election, that it gets thrown into the House of Representatives, which is part of our 12th Amendment to the Constitution. Each state gets a single vote. So if there are enough Republican states that they outweigh the Democratic states, Trump could be put in office, even legally, even though he loses the popular vote. And that was, of course, what John Eastman, who was one of the architects of the 2020 plan, wanted to do. He had a number of layers, and one of it was, okay, we'll just say that enough of these electoral votes are too confusing, so we can't count them, and that will throw the presidential election into the House of Representatives. So anyway, that's a long way to go around about what's happening on the border, because people keep writing to me and saying, oh, it's just like the Civil War and on and on. And I think it is, but only in the sense that it's a way for a minority to game the system so that they can put pressure on the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court might very well, and it actually looks like they will, tear apart the Chevron doctrine and tear apart federal regulation of the businesses of those people who are supporting the Republican governments in the states. And that's, of course, exactly what we saw in the period from in the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s, when the states got taken over by big business and became really tools of big business. And that's, of course, where we get the popular election of senators in the early 20th century. So I think it looks like the Civil War, but not in the way people are thinking, that you're going to have, the states' rights on one hand and the federal government's rights on the other. I actually think that what Abbott is trying to do is set up a court case, I guess is what I'm saying, and that he is doing it using this language, and these Republican state governors are getting on board for that same reason, that they would like more power too, and they will be able to continue to control their states if the power devolves to the states, so that the federal government can't say, hey, wait a minute, you have to redistrict, you have to do the sorts of things it's saying on occasion now. And that seems to me to be a much bigger story than just what's happening on the Texas border. So that's what I was thinking. I was musing about. I hope that that's useful, and I hope that's giving you some bigger ways to think about what's happening, because I find these days that there's just so much coming at you all the time that it's very hard to figure out what's really going on. And the other piece of that, of course, is that if indeed I keep wanting to call him Johnson. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, manages to kill the deal to give more money to Ukraine. And we don't actually give money to Ukraine. What we do is we appropriate funding for Ukraine, and then we send them munitions that we have. That's why it's so important that the United States continue to be involved in the coalition, because lots of other countries are shoveling money in that direction, but it's for humanitarian aid. It's for military contracts, but because of the fact they don't have big militaries, they don't have extra military munitions or anything. So we're the ones who've been supplying that. And if we stop doing that, which is what's at stake here, that of course means that Ukraine, which everybody keeps saying Ukraine isn't advancing fast enough, and I don't quite know what that means. If you follow the Institute for the Study of War, which you can find online, it's a nonpartisan group out of the UK, which every day takes a look at what's happening in war zones across the globe. They'll point out that Ukraine has taken back half the land that Vladimir Putin took in his initial advance, and they've regained control over the Black Sea, and they've opened up corridors to get grain out to Africa, which was a huge deal because it meant that Africa was at the real mercy of the war, and they've managed to get around that. But that will all be lost. And if that is lost, Vladimir Putin, who's actually really in trouble financially right now because of the sanctions, and he's essentially had to become a bit of a client state to China at this point, he will be able to take over Ukraine. And of course, they're really hoping that Trump will be back in power because Trump's going to break up NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is currently standing against the expansion of Russia and trying to support Ukraine without getting involved itself. Because once NATO gets involved, it's a war against NATO, and everybody has to get involved who's a NATO signatory, including the U.S. And that's something that the U.S. would like to avoid. So in addition to what's going on over the border with this attempt, I think, to center power in the states, part of that also means that the U.S. is walking away from its global responsibilities because of the radical Republicans, and it is a game changer, and it's a game changer that I've said before. I do have opinions about this stuff. I don't think that would be a good idea. I think that the United States provides stability around the globe. But I will say that I don't know what the future is. Maybe it'd be a good thing for the United States not to be out front any longer and taking on everything it has taken on in the past. I think we would find that would turn into a real problem really quickly. But one of the things it would definitely do is once the United States leaves that table, it will never go back. It will never be welcomed back again, because all those countries that trusted us for all the things that we promised them would say, screw you. We don't ever want to work with you again because we don't trust you. And you can already see the EU, for example, starting to talk about the fact they can't trust the United States these days because they never know who's going to be in power next. And that's something that people, I think, should think about. Do you think that's a good thing, or do you think that's a bad thing? And why? Because it's certainly not the world that we've known since World War II. And like I say, maybe it'd be good. I don't think it would be, but maybe you think that would be a better plan. It's worth thinking through what that would look like. Anyway, somebody said you needed to be left on a happy note, which I always do. And the letters have not been happy, somebody said lately. And maybe that's true. I think maybe it's true not because the world has gotten darker, or even that I've gotten darker, but because I've gotten enough time to actually think again, which I didn't for a long time because I was so tired and I was just reacting to the news. I hope that things seem smarter these days. Maybe not, because maybe sometimes when you're thinking, things go fallow for a while. But it's not that I am less enthusiastic about the country. I actually think that the reason you're seeing such hysteria on the right is because it recognizes that it's on the ropes. I think if you look at the scandals that are starting to come out on the right, if you look at the extraordinary number of Americans who are working together to say we don't want any part of the authoritarianism that Donald Trump is openly embracing. I think if you look at the increasing degree that legacy media is starting to call him out. They're not doing it fully, but they're starting to call him out. I think if you look at the new tone that the Biden administration has taken, really calling him out. And I think if you take a look at the increasing amount of attention that Vice President Kamala Harris is getting, somebody said to me the other day, a young person said to me the other day, why do people say she's not popular? She's like, we love her. And I think if you actually look, you will see that Kamala Harris has a huge following among young Americans, among women, among people of color who are proud of the fact that she is championing the idea of equality before the law. I think there are many, many signs that American democracy is reasserting itself. What is worrying is that we have this very small minority right now of Republicans in the House of Representatives who are simply unable to govern and who are trying to get around that by screaming no, by impeaching, trying to impeach this Homeland Secretary Mayorkas. They wrote articles of impeachment before they ever heard hearings. They are all performance, but unfortunately, people voted them into positions of power where they are able to put the brakes on everything, not just on aid to Ukraine, aid to Israel, aid to Taiwan, the border crisis, but even our appropriations bills. And I think that is really dangerous because they've got at least another year in power. And people have asked what they can do. And the answer is what I always say: take up oxygen. Call and say you want the border deal, or you want aid to Ukraine, or you want whatever it is you want. But now is the moment. I think the next 10 months are the moment to make sure your voice is heard. And one of the things that heard, not just in advocacy, but also in saying things, what is true and what is not. And Google is your friend, by the way. Maybe I should do a session on how to know what's true and what's not. But somebody sent me something today saying, there's all this misinformation about these 3 soldiers who were killed, and I was like, no, that's disinformation. Not, I didn't get it wrong; they got it wrong. And you can see here the sources, because we're going to get swamped with this going forward. We already know that Russia and China and Iran are very active in social media. But the trick is that if they can reach people through social media, so can we. And we can also reach people, our neighbors, our friends, the people in our communities, by talking. And as you know, one of my colleagues and friends on my Facebook page has just started a series of cards that you can leave places that give you talking points. Now and for the next 10 months, this is really about regular Americans like you and me taking our country back from that very small group of people who are trying to impose their will on us. And remember, one of the great pieces about this is that you are not trying to convince somebody of something that only 3% of Americans hold. If you are in favor of common sense gun safety regulations, you have more than 80% of Americans behind you. This is not a controversial position. Similarly, abortion rights, 69% of Americans want to see Roe reinstated. These are not fringe positions. These are the positions of the vast majority of Americans who need to be able to make their voices heard in a system that has increasingly been taken over by a very small group of radicals. So I'm actually continuing to be a bull on American democracy. A bull tosses things up with its horns, a bear claws them down. But it's going to take all of us working together. And that's the fun of it. It's a creative, fun time that we meet new people and we do new stuff. And we with luck, get the country that we want and maybe deserve. All right, I'm off. I will talk to you later. Thank you for being here.